Greetings, everyone. Welcome back. We're now on chapter 2. I'm calling this part 1, even though our chapter isn't really laid out in the same way. But let's get started.
As an overview of the whole chapter, after reading it, you should be able to distinguish between various materials, processes, and methods in the production of art objects, identify the characteristics of different art forms and distinguish one from another. And really what we're focusing on in my lectures, we're talking about explaining the roles of elements and principles of design in creating forms and compositions. And specifically, this lecture covers the elements of design, or what are also called the visual elements. How do we start talking about a work of art like this, which is by Elizabeth Murray? We can start with the basic building blocks, what are called the visual elements, or what our textbook, Introduction to Art, calls the elements of design. These are line, shape, mass and volume, perspective or space, texture and pattern, color, and light or tone. And with the asterisk, I've shown the particular elements from our textbook, Introduction to Art. These do vary somewhat depending on the source. Using the visual elements helps us to analyze our experiences with works of art. These terms are also used as a kind of fundamental language for any kind of discussion about a work of art. So what does what I have on the screen here have to do with elements of design? Well, think of baking ingredients as raw materials. You can't get this finished product of these lovely baguettes unless you do something with your raw materials. So the elements of design, or visual elements, are like raw materials, and the way you use them is the principle of design, basically, to continue that analogy. Also think of the visual elements or elements of design as nouns. They're things. And the principles, which we'll talk about in the next lecture, they're actions, they're verbs. Let's start with the most fundamental element, line. Line is defined as the path of a moving point. An outline defines a two-dimensional shape as if it were casting a shadow underneath it, say, and contour lines record boundaries and define more specifically what shapes represent. We might think of this as the path that the eye follows. Here's what we might call a layout for an animation. Notice how the artist is directing our eye through a linear element that will only be implied in the finished version. Artists use lines to direct and move our eyes around a work of art. Vertical lines can seem more assertive and denote growth and strength. Horizontal lines seem to be more calm, and diagonal lines are more dramatic and imply some sort of action or imbalance. Well, it's easier to think of line in terms of drawing. Notice how Henri Cartier-Bresson in this photograph is using quite a few linear elements of various railings and apparently canopy supports to draw your eye around the composition. Take a moment to look at it. You've probably already figured out that lines do not need to be continuous. They can be broken or merely some kind of implication of a line. Here's a painting by Rococo artist Jean-Antoine Watteau, The Embarkation for Cythera. Take a moment to look at this painting and see where your eye starts and stops and where your eye is led when looking at this painting. You may or may not have followed this schematic here, where your eye would have started on the right-hand side and flowed across the painting, up and then down the mast of the ship. It's a little hard to tell in a reproduction like this what the experience with the actual painting would be like, but certainly this implied line is there. The next element is shape, and it can be created by line, texture, or some kind of color change, for instance. Shape is basically a two-dimensional form that occupies an area with identifiable boundaries. The two big categories of shapes are geometric and organic. Geometric forms can be mathematically defined, and as you might imagine, organic forms look more natural. And as in this example of it's oil paint on paper, we actually have a combination of the two different types of shapes, organic and geometric. You might find this initially to be a difficult topic, this idea of figure and ground. Figure is the positive shape on which the visual focus is placed. So think of let's see, a person doing the weather forecast. They're standing in front of the green screen with the weather. The figure is the weathercaster, and the ground is the negative shape or the area behind the person. But obviously, the negative shape or this background area does not have to reflect a landscape or any other thing. From my lecture on chapter 1, this is an example of an unstable figure-ground relationship because what you see depends on whichever clue you're reading. At that moment, you either see the beautiful young woman looking at herself in the mirror if you focus, say, on her facial features, and then if you squint your eyes a little bit, say, it becomes much more easy to see the skull form. Artists can use implied shapes to help unify compositions, and an implied shape can create a sense of order. A great example is Raphael's The Madonna of the Meadows. Notice how, let's see, I think it's John the Baptist here on the left, the Virgin's face here, and her right foot create this kind of triangular element, an implied triangle that creates a kind of balance and solidity in this composition. Mass, quite simply, is a three-dimensional form that occupies a volume. You can think of it as a three-dimensional shape if you want to. As a matter of fact, notice how the masses in this sculpture basically create shapes, and you're seeing a two-dimensional version of a three-dimensional sculpture. This is by Bill Reed and is at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Our textbook, Introduction to Art, uses the term perspective when discussing spatial relationships. Space interacts with other visual elements and helps give them definition. There exists both negative and positive space, sort of like we saw with the discussion of figure-ground relationships. Notice how Do Ho Suh uses a kind of a mirror image to create space where it actually doesn't exist in the reflection of the gate in the ceiling. We saw in an earlier slide that three-dimensional space has height, width, and depth. Two-dimensional space has only two dimensions, height and width. But we can have implied space where items overlap, foreground, middle ground, background, for instance, with the background, the image, what appears the image that's overlapped, the item that's overlapped, seems to be farther away from us. And then, of course, there's illusionistic space. Foreshortening, linear, isometric, and atmospheric perspective are examples of this illusionistic space. This work of art, which is a furniture decoration, is a wonderful example of vanishing point, single point, or linear perspective. All those terms basically mean the same thing. Everything converges, all the lines converge on an imaginary point on the horizon. Here's a schematic version of linear perspective with one point linear perspective or vanishing point perspective, and then 2-point linear perspective. And of course, you can have two vanishing points too. Notice how an artist like Masaccio brilliantly uses single point perspective to create an illusionistic space, but also to highlight the role of Jesus slightly off center in this painting. Now, this is where it gets a little more fun. Texture and pattern are perceived surface qualities of a work of art but they can be actual, that is, they can be real, or it can be an implication of a texture. Actual texture would be something that you could touch or feel. Implied texture is the illusion of that thing. And then pattern is any decorative, repetitive motif. But we will also see this as a design element too. So think of pattern as also a process. It's kind of crossing over from a visual element into a principle of design in my mind. So you might remember from chapter 1, we talked about a bronze version of Brancusi's Bird in Space. Here is a marble version. So you can sort of sense this sort of soft skin-like texture in the sculpture. And then Samuel Fosso on the right-hand side, the chief, he who sold Africa to the colonists from his self-portrait series. This is, as far as I know, not photoshopped. He's sitting against this backdrop of patterned fabrics. So it's a photograph of actual patterned fabrics, creating an implied texture in a two-dimensional image. Now, if you're not familiar with color theory, this can be a bit difficult at first. We have the color wheel here on the right-hand side, which I imagine most of you are familiar with. We have primary colors, yellow, red, blue, secondary colors, between those colors, and then tertiary colors. You mix the primary and secondary colors together. Perhaps more useful to our analysis of paintings is the idea of warm colors representing a certain kind of feeling, and then cool colors on the blue-green side of the color wheel representing, perhaps melancholy or calmness, say. More technically, adding white to a color is called a tint, so turning it into a pastel, for instance. And then a shade is adding black to any given color. Notice how Camille Pissarro keeps this color scheme under control at the middle of the painting. This is basically what we could call an analogous color scheme. The colors are close to each other on the color wheel, or adjacent to each other. Yellow is next to green, and blue is also next to green, for instance. A little bit of terminology. Hue is just the name of a color, red, green, say. Value is the relative lightness or darkness of a color. You can often determine this by squinting and seeing how bright the color seems when you remove that sort of color characteristic. And then intensity, or chroma or saturation, is the relative purity of a color. How much has it been mixed with other colors or not? On the left, we have a great example, a color wheel with corresponding grayscale values. So notice how bright the yellow is and how dark that purple is at the bottom. The strip indicated as B is blue in a range of value or tints. Values are tints, so white is added as we go down the strip. C is yellow, orange, progressively dulled with gray, black. These are shades. And then interestingly here on D, yellow, orange is progressively dulled with blue, violet. So this is the blue violet is yellow orange's opposite or complement, and we get a kind of warmer shade, and I think a more sophisticated shade in a way. So a little bit about color schemes, as we saw in Pissarro's painting on his palette. A color scheme is the selective use of two or more colors in a single composition. Monochromatic is variations of the same hue, so in a way we could say it's a single color. Complementary, these are hues directly opposite each other on the color wheel. Analogous, as in the Pissarro painting, adjacent hues on the color wheel. And triadic is three equidistant hues on the color wheel. Here's a compelling example of a monochromatic painting. Pointillism is a technique of applying dots of color that are mixed by our eyes to produce a kind of illusion of a particular color. This is an optical color mixture, and actually a computer monitor or TV screen does this. Here's a painted example by Georges Seurat. So it's hard to see in this reproduction, but if we were to get close, we would see individual bits of color, and as we get farther away, it blends into the image we see here. Color obviously has a strong emotional effect on the viewer. Much of this is quite subjective and personal. Some of it's cultural. Notice for yourself the different sort of mood that Whistler's painting on the left creates versus Edvard Munch's Scream on the right. Here's a little additional material from a textbook called Living with Art. It divides up the visual elements or elements of design into a few more categories. So the fundamental purpose of light is to show us the material world. It helps us understand forms and spatial relationships. Our textbook, Introduction to Art, subsumes light under the color category, but basically we're talking about the same thing. Both actual and illusionistic light are used and are important for artwork. Of course, we have actual light in the artwork or illusionistic light, the impression of light created by the artwork within that artwork. So here we have an example. This amazing piece by Doug Wheeler uses actual light to create a kind of illusionistic effect of this movie screen floating in space. But with works of art, we might actually be more familiar with this kind of implied light and not even thinking about it. There are different ways that artists can use implied light in a work of art. So shading and modeling using chiaroscuro, that just means light dark, or values to create implied mass. Value is relative lightness or darkness. And, this chiaroscuro creates contrasts of light and shadow. We'll close here with this excellent example of chiaroscuro. Sometimes I've heard this term sfumato too. The chiaroscuro is the light dark, and this overall smoky haze that Da Vinci liked to use is sometimes called sfumato, which just means smoke. I will see you in the next lecture.